June 17, 1959. Binghamton General Hospital, Binghamton, New York. 3:47 a.m. Joseph Barber Sr. dies of a heart attack. He is 52 years old. His widow sits beside the bed, her face blank with exhaustion and grief. His children wait in the corridor outside. His doctors are not surprised. Barbara has suffered 3 major heart attacks in the 18 months since November 14, 1957. His health has deteriorated so rapidly, so completely, that even his enemies have felt something approaching pity. But the enemies outnumber the mourners. Barbara's funeral 3 days later is sparsely attended. A few relatives, a handful of old friends, no mob bosses, no business associates, no one who might draw police attention or be photographed by federal agents who are certainly watching. The man who once hosted the most powerful criminals in America now goes to his grave attended by almost no one. 18 months earlier, Joseph Barber was wealthy, respected, apparently legitimate. He operated Canada Dry bottling franchises, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. He lived in a sprawling estate on 58 acres outside Apalachin, New York. He was generous to local charities. He was polite to neighbors. He cultivated the image of a successful immigrant businessman living the American dream. Then, on November 14, 1957, he made one catastrophic decision. He agreed to host a meeting of Mafia bosses at his estate. That decision destroyed everything. It cost him his businesses, his reputation, his health, and ultimately his life. It exposed organized crime's national structure to law enforcement and the public. It triggered a cascade of consequences that would reshape the American Mafia for decades. Joseph Barbara's death less than 2 years after Apalachin is not merely the end of one man's life. It is the conclusion of the Mafia's invisible empire, the decades when organized crime operated with impunity, confident that corruption and denial would protect it from serious investigation. Apalachin ended that era. What followed was federal awakening, aggressive prosecution, internal suspicion, and organizational chaos. The meeting that was supposed to consolidate Vito Genovese's power instead destroyed him. The gathering intended to settle disputes instead created new ones. The afternoon that should have been routine instead became the Mafia's greatest self-inflicted disaster. This is the story of what happened after the mobsters fled through the woods. This is the story of how Apalachin's dominoes fell, crushing some men, elevating others, and transforming American law enforcement. This is the story of how one afternoon in rural New York changed everything. November 15th, 1957. The morning after. Joseph Barber wakes in his estate to a nightmare. His carefully constructed life is collapsing. Newspapers across the country are running stories about the mob convention at his home. His name is in every article. Reporters are camped outside his property. Neighbors who once respected him now view him with suspicion and fear. The phone rings constantly. Journalists demanding interviews, business associates distancing themselves, anonymous callers making threats. Barbara's first instinct is to maintain his cover story. He was hosting a simple gathering of friends and business acquaintances. Nothing illegal occurred. The state police overreacted. He is a legitimate businessman being persecuted because of his Italian heritage. His lawyers issue statements emphasizing Barbara's spotless criminal record. Technically true, he has been arrested multiple times but never convicted of serious crimes, and his standing in the community. But the cover story is transparently false. No legitimate businessman hosts 60 visitors who flee when police arrive. No innocent gathering requires guests from Florida, California, Ohio, and Cuba. No routine social event involves men with extensive criminal records telling identical lies about sick friends and barbecues. Within days, the consequences begin. The Canada Dry Corporation, for which Barber holds several lucrative bottling franchises, investigates his background. They discover or finally acknowledge what law enforcement has known for years. Joseph Barber is not a legitimate businessman. He is a criminal who has used his bottling operations to launder money and provide legitimate cover for mob activities. Canada Dry revokes his franchises. His primary source of legal income vanishes. His other businesses face similar scrutiny. Partners distance themselves. Suppliers refuse to work with him. Customers cancel contracts. Banks that once extended credit now demand immediate payment. The financial empire Barbara built over 2 decades unravels within weeks. He is not merely embarrassed, he is financially destroyed. The legal consequences are worse. On December 6, 1957, less than 3 weeks after the Apalachin meeting, a federal grand jury in New York subpoenas Barbara to testify about the gathering. He appears on December 16th. When asked about the meeting's purpose, the attendees' identities, and the discussions that occurred, Barbara invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination on virtually every substantive question. This refusal to testify triggers conspiracy charges. Federal prosecutors indict Barbara and 26 other Appalachian attendees on charges of conspiring to obstruct justice by refusing to explain the meeting. The legal theory is creative but defensible. By lying about the meeting's purpose and refusing to provide truthful testimony, the defendants are obstructing federal investigation of organized crime. Barbara hires expensive lawyers. He prepares for trial. He faces the prospect of prison at age 51, with failing health and destroyed finances. The stress is enormous. On January 25, 1958, while consulting with his attorneys, Barbara suffers a massive heart attack. He survives but is hospitalized for weeks. His doctors warn that another major coronary event will likely be fatal. He is released from the hospital in late February 1958, but his health never recovers. He has persistent chest pain, shortness of breath, and crushing fatigue. He takes cardiac medications that provide limited relief. He can no longer manage his remaining business interests effectively. He spends most days at home, declining visitors, avoiding the public scrutiny that follows him everywhere. The conspiracy trial begins in May 1959. Barbara is too ill to attend most sessions. His lawyers seek postponements based on medical necessity. When he does appear in court, he looks 20 years older than his actual age, gray, gaunt, stooped. The jury sees a broken man, not a powerful mobster. On May 28, 1959, the jury convicts Barbara and 19 other defendants of conspiracy to obstruct justice. Barbara is sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and fined $10,000. He will never serve a day. His health is too precarious for imprisonment. The judge grants bail pending appeal, recognizing that Barbara's physical condition makes incarceration impractical. Barbara returns home to await appellate decisions that he will not live to see. On June 17, 1959, his heart finally gives out. The fourth major attack in 18 months proves fatal. Joseph Barbara dies knowing that the decision to host a meeting destroyed everything he built. His legitimate businesses are gone. His reputation is ruined. His family faces financial hardship and social stigma. His name is forever associated with organized crime's greatest public relations disaster. His widow, Josephine, later files lawsuits seeking compensation for the lost bottling franchises and other business interests. She claims her husband was a legitimate businessman persecuted by overzealous law enforcement. The courts reject her claims. The legal consensus is clear. Joseph Barbara was a criminal who used his businesses as fronts for organized crime. His destruction was self-inflicted. The estate where the meeting occurred is sold in 1960. The new owners, seeking to escape the property's notoriety, subdivide the land. The main house remains, but the 58-acre compound is broken into smaller parcels. Tour buses occasionally drive past, guides pointing out the location of the famous Mafia meeting. Local historians erect historical markers. The property becomes a curiosity, a footnote in true crime history. But for Joseph Barbara's family, Apalachin is not history. It is a wound that never heals. His children grow up with their father's name permanently linked to organized crime. They face discrimination, suspicion, and endless questions about what they knew and when they knew it. Some change their names. Others leave New York entirely. None escape the shadow of November 14, 1957. Joseph Barbara's death is Apalachin's first and most direct casualty, but it is far from the last. Vito Genovese is 60 years old in November 1957. He has spent 4 decades clawing his way to the top of New York's organized crime hierarchy. He has survived wars, prosecutions, and multiple attempts on his life. He has murdered rivals, including Willie Moretti in 1951 and Albert Anastasia in October 1957. He has finally achieved his ultimate goal: recognition as the most powerful mafia boss in America. The Apalachin meeting is supposed to be his coronation. He has called the gathering to ratify his position as boss of the Genovese family, previously led by Frank Costello, who Genovese attempted to murder in May 1957. He wants the Commission's formal acknowledgement that he is the dominant figure in American organized crime. He wants to discuss narcotics policy, territorial boundaries, and organizational discipline. He wants to demonstrate that he commands respect from families across the country. Instead, Apalachin becomes his downfall. The immediate damage is humiliation. Genovese, who prides himself on his cunning and strategic planning, has made an elementary mistake. He approved a gathering so large and so visible that local law enforcement noticed it. He assured other bosses that the meeting would be secure, that Joseph Barber's estate was an ideal location. That state police lacked the sophistication to recognize what was occurring. He was catastrophically wrong on all counts. When the state police establish their roadblock and attendees flee through the woods, Genovese is among those who run. The most powerful mob boss in America, the man who has murdered his way to supremacy, scrambles through underbrush in a $500 suit, hiding from rural cops with notebooks. He is found in the woods, covered in mud and burrs, and brought to the roadblock for questioning. His explanations, he was visiting his sick friend, he stopped by for lunch, are transparently false and make national headlines. The photographs are damaging beyond measure. Vito Genovese, standing beside a state police cruiser, looking old and frightened and ridiculous. This is not the image of a powerful crime boss. This is a scared man who made terrible decisions and got caught. But humiliation is the least of Genovese's problems. Apalachin exposes him to federal scrutiny at the worst possible time. The government has been building a narcotics case against him, gathering evidence that Genovese has been deeply involved in heroin trafficking, despite the Commission's supposed prohibition on drug dealing. The investigation has been slow, hampered by witnesses who refuse to cooperate and evidence that is mostly circumstantial. Apalachin changes everything. Suddenly, federal prosecutors have enormous public pressure to pursue mafia bosses. Suddenly, they have photographs of Genovese fleeing from police. Suddenly, witnesses who were reluctant to cooperate become more willing, recognizing that Genovese is vulnerable. The narcotics investigation accelerates. The key witness is Nelson Cantelops, a Puerto Rican drug dealer who agrees to testify against Genovese in exchange for leniency on his own charges. Cantelops claims he personally delivered heroin to Genovese and witnessed Genovese discussing drug trafficking operations. His testimony is problematic. He is a convicted felon with obvious motivation to lie, but prosecutors believe he is credible enough to convince a jury. The trial begins in March 1959. Genovese, along with 14 co-defendants, faces charges of conspiring to import and distribute narcotics. The evidence is substantial. Testimony from multiple witnesses, surveillance documenting meetings between defendants, financial records showing unexplained cash transactions. Genovese's lawyers attack the credibility of witnesses, arguing that the entire case is built on testimony from criminals seeking to reduce their own sentences. But the jury believes the prosecution. On April 17, 1959, Genovese and 13 others are convicted on all counts. On April 30th, he is sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. At age 61, this is effectively a life sentence. Even with good behavior, Genovese will be in his mid-70s before release. The conviction destroys Genovese's power. He can no longer manage day-to-day operations from federal prison in Atlanta. He cannot attend commission meetings. He cannot resolve disputes between crews. He cannot order executions or approve major criminal operations. He maintains some influence through prison visits and coded messages, but his authority is fundamentally diminished. Worse, his imprisonment creates suspicion within his own family and the broader mafia. Many mobsters believe Genovese was set up, that someone provided information to federal authorities, that someone ensured witnesses cooperated, that someone wanted Genovese imprisoned. The question becomes, who betrayed him? Suspicion falls on several candidates. Frank Costello, The former boss whom Genovese tried to murder certainly had motive for revenge. Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mobster with extensive connections, may have provided information to federal authorities. Carlo Gambino, who benefited enormously from Genovese's imprisonment, becomes the prime suspect for many observers. The theory that Gambino orchestrated Genovese's downfall is never proven, but is widely believed within the Mafia. The narrative makes sense. Gambino helped murder Albert Anastasia, allowing him to become boss of that family. He then ensured that the Apalachin meeting occurred, knowing it would expose attendees to law enforcement scrutiny. He provided information, or ensured others provided information, that led to Genovese's narcotics conviction. With Genovese imprisoned, Gambino emerged as the most powerful boss in New York, and arguably in the entire country. Whether or not this theory is accurate, Genovese believes it. From prison, he becomes increasingly paranoid and bitter. He suspects betrayal everywhere. He issues orders for murders of suspected informants. He feuds with other imprisoned mobsters. He deteriorates physically and psychologically, consumed by rage over his destroyed empire. Vito Genovese dies in federal prison on February 14, 1969, of a heart attack. He is 71 years old. He has spent the final decade of his life behind bars, his power gone, his reputation damaged, his dreams of dominance destroyed. His death attracts minimal attention. He is simply another old mobster who died in prison, no different from dozens of others. But Genovese's destruction demonstrates Apalachin's cascading consequences. The meeting he called to consolidate power instead triggered his downfall. The gathering intended to demonstrate his authority instead exposed him to prosecution. The afternoon that should have been routine instead became the beginning of the end. And watching all of this, calculating his own moves with characteristic patience and cunning, was the man who would benefit most from Apalachin's chaos: Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino is 55 years old in November 1957. He is the underboss of the family formerly led by Albert Anastasia, who was murdered on October 25, 1957, in the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. Gambino almost certainly helped orchestrate that murder, working with Vito Genovese to eliminate Anastasia, who had become too unpredictable, too violent, and too independent. With Anastasia dead, Gambino expects to become boss of the family. But the succession is not automatic. Other powerful members might challenge him. The commission must approve. Anastasia's loyal supporters might seek revenge. The Apalachin meeting is supposed to formalize Gambino's new position and prevent internal warfare. Instead, Apalachin threatens to destroy everything. When state police establish the roadblock, Gambino is among the first to be stopped and questioned. He provides the same absurd alibis as everyone else. He was visiting Joe Barbara, who is sick. He heard there was a barbecue. The troopers record his information. Carlo Gambino, age 55, 2230 Ocean Parkway, Brooklyn, New York, and eventually release him. But unlike Joseph Barbara and Vito Genovese, Gambino survives Apalachin relatively unscathed. He is not charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice, possibly because his answers to police, while obviously false, were not provably different from what he told the grand jury. He is not targeted in major federal investigations. He is subpoenaed to testify before the McClellan Committee hearings on organized crime, but he invokes his Fifth Amendment rights and faces no consequences. Most importantly, Gambino does not panic. While other bosses are scrambling to protect themselves, while Genovese is facing narcotics charges, while families are fractured by suspicion and internal conflict, Gambino remains calm, patient, and calculating. He understands that Apalachin has created opportunity as well as crisis. The old order is collapsing. New leadership will emerge. And Gambino intends to be at the top. His strategy is brilliance itself. He does nothing dramatic. He does not seek public recognition. He does not engage in warfare with rivals. He does not draw law enforcement attention. He simply waits for his enemies to destroy themselves while he quietly consolidates power. When Vito Genovese is convicted and imprisoned in 1959, Gambino expresses public sympathy while privately celebrating. Genovese's imprisonment removes the most ambitious and dangerous rival. The Genovese family, leaderless and demoralized, is no longer a serious threat to Gambino's dominance. When Joseph Profaci, boss of one of New York's 5 families, becomes embroiled in internal warfare with rebellious members of his own family in the early 1960s, Gambino again waits patiently. The Profaci-Gallo War, later called the First Colombo War, weakens that family through years of bloodshed. Profaci dies of liver cancer in 1962. His successor, Joseph Magliocco, survives only a year before dying of a heart attack. The family is decimated, posing no threat to Gambino. When Joseph Bonanno, another powerful boss who attended Apalachin, becomes involved in a plot to murder other commission members in 1964, Gambino ensures the plot is exposed. Bonanno is forced into hiding, eventually kidnapped, probably by his own family members seeking to end his increasingly erratic leadership, and spends years in exile before finally retiring. Another rival eliminated without Gambino firing a shot. Throughout the 1960s, while federal authorities are pursuing other mob bosses with increasing aggression, Gambino remains largely untouched. The FBI has a file on him. Agents conduct surveillance. They know he is a boss, but they cannot gather sufficient evidence to charge him with major crimes. He is too careful, too disciplined, too well insulated from direct criminal activity. By the late 1960s, Carlo Gambino is universally recognized as the most powerful mafia boss in America. He controls the largest and wealthiest crime family in New York. He has influence over labor unions, particularly the International Longshoremen's Association, giving him control over New York's waterfront. He operates extensive loan sharking, gambling, and labor racketeering operations. He has connections to legitimate businesses that launder criminal profits and provide legal income for family members. Most importantly, he commands respect from other families. When disputes arise, bosses seek Gambino's mediation. When major decisions must be made, Gambino's opinion carries enormous weight. He is not officially designated boss of bosses. Such titles are discouraged within La Cosa Nostra, but everyone understands that Gambino is first among equals. His success is all the more remarkable because he achieved it by being the opposite of Vito Genovese. Genovese was ambitious, aggressive, publicly seeking recognition. Gambino was patient, quiet, avoiding attention. Genovese used violence constantly. Gambino used violence selectively, only when necessary. Genovese made enemies easily. Gambino cultivated relationships carefully. The contrast between their fates is instructive. Genovese called the Apalachin meeting to demonstrate his power, and instead triggered his own destruction. Gambino attended the same meeting, suffered the same humiliation of fleeing through woods, but emerged stronger because he understood that survival required discretion rather than demonstration. Did Gambino sabotage the Apalachin meeting? The theory is tantalizing but unprovable. Some historians believe Gambino ensured that Sergeant Edgar Croswell became aware of the gathering, perhaps through anonymous tips or through intermediaries who knew Croswell was already suspicious of Joseph Barbara. Others believe Gambino provided information to federal authorities that led to Genovese's narcotics conviction. Still others believe Gambino simply benefited from events he did not orchestrate. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Gambino probably did not tip off the state police directly. Such a betrayal would have been too risky if discovered. But he may have failed to discourage the meeting, knowing it was likely to be discovered. He may have provided information to federal authorities indirectly, through cutouts who could not be traced back to him. He may have positioned himself to benefit from whatever outcome occurred. What is certain is that Gambino survived and prospered while others fell. By 1976, when he died of natural causes at age 74, he had been boss of his family for nearly 2 decades. He had avoided prosecution for major crimes throughout his career. He had outlived most of his rivals and enemies. He died wealthy, powerful, and relatively secure, the ultimate success for a mafia boss. And it all began at Apalachin, where the most powerful boss destroyed himself while the quiet underboss watched, calculated, and waited for his moment. November 15, 1957, FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C. J. Edgar Hoover reads the morning newspapers with growing alarm. The Apalachin story is on every front page. Photographs show state police questioning well-dressed men beside expensive cars. Lists of attendees identify them as known or suspected criminals from across the country. Editorial writers ask pointed questions. How could such a gathering occur without FBI knowledge? If the Mafia exists and is organized nationally, why has the FBI director repeatedly denied it? Hoover's first instinct is damage control. He orders FBI field offices to gather information about the Apalachin attendees immediately. He wants to demonstrate that the FBI was already investigating these individuals, that the Bureau was aware of their activities, that the New York State Police simply stumbled upon something the FBI was already monitoring. But this narrative falls apart quickly. FBI files on most Apalachin attendees are minimal. Some have no files at all. The Bureau has been so focused on investigating communism and subversion that organized crime has been virtually ignored. When agents compile reports on the Apalachin attendees, the documents are embarrassingly thin. A few arrest records, some local police intelligence, little evidence of serious federal investigation. The contrast with state and local police is humiliating. Sergeant Edgar Croswell has a thick file on Joseph Barbara, documenting years of surveillance and investigation. Local police departments in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania have extensive intelligence on many attendees. But the FBI, with its vast resources and national jurisdiction, has been looking the other way. Hoover cannot admit this publicly. His reputation is built on the FBI's supposed omniscience, its ability to identify and neutralize threats to American security. Acknowledging that organized crime has operated for decades without serious FBI attention would be catastrophic for his image. So Hoover pivots, claiming that the FBI has always taken organized crime seriously, but has been hampered by jurisdictional limitations and lack of federal laws targeting racketeering. This explanation satisfies no one. Journalists point out that the FBI has aggressively investigated communists, many of whom have committed no federal crimes, but has ignored mobsters who clearly violate federal laws against extortion, narcotics trafficking, and interstate criminal activity. Congressional leaders demand explanations. Attorney General William Rogers faces pressure to direct the FBI to prioritize organized crime investigations. On November 27, 1957, less than 2 weeks after Apalachin, Hoover issues a directive creating the Top Hoodlum Program. Every FBI field office is ordered to identify the 10 most significant organized crime figures in their jurisdiction and initiate intensive investigations. Agents are to conduct surveillance, cultivate informants, gather intelligence, and develop evidence for prosecution. The program is given priority equal to counterintelligence investigations. The directive represents a complete reversal of decades of FBI policy. Hoover is now ordering agents to do precisely what he has previously claimed was unnecessary or impossible. The Top Hoodlum Program is an implicit admission that organized crime is a serious national problem requiring federal attention. It is also an acknowledgement that the FBI has been negligent. But changing FBI culture proves difficult. Many agents have spent their entire careers investigating communists, bank robbers, and kidnappers. They have no experience with organized crime investigations, which require different techniques: long-term surveillance, undercover operations, cultivation of informants within criminal organizations. They face criminals who maintain codes of silence, who have extensive political connections, and who use sophisticated methods to insulate leadership from direct criminal activity. Moreover, organized crime investigations are less satisfying than the cases that have traditionally enhanced FBI agents' careers. Capturing a bank robber or communist spy produces clear, immediate results: arrests, convictions, publicity. Investigating a mafia family requires years of work with uncertain outcomes. Prosecutors may decline to pursue cases based on insufficient evidence. Witnesses may refuse to testify. Convictions may be overturned on appeal. The work is frustrating and often unrewarding. Nevertheless, the Top Hoodlum Program marks the beginning of the FBI's serious engagement with organized crime. Throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, agents develop expertise in investigating mob families. They learn to conduct long-term surveillance operations. They cultivate informants within criminal organizations, sometimes offering leniency or witness protection in exchange for cooperation. They use wiretaps and electronic surveillance to gather evidence. They build comprehensive cases that document criminal enterprises rather than simply individual crimes. The program produces results, though slowly. In 1959, agents in Chicago develop evidence that leads to the prosecution of several organized crime figures for extortion. In 1960, New York agents gather intelligence that helps federal prosecutors pursue labor racketeering cases. Throughout the 1960s, FBI investigations contribute to numerous convictions of mob members, though these victories are incremental rather than transformative. The more significant impact is cultural. The FBI gradually develops institutional expertise in organized crime investigations. Agents share intelligence across field offices, creating a national picture of how different families interact and coordinate. They identify key figures, organizational structures, and criminal operations. They begin to understand the Mafia, not as isolated local gangs, but as a national enterprise with coordinated leadership. This understanding becomes crucial when Congress passes the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act in 1970. RICO provides federal prosecutors with powerful new tools to attack organized crime. It allows them to charge entire criminal enterprises rather than just individual crimes. It permits asset forfeiture, and it establishes enhanced penalties for racketeering activities. But RICO is only effective if prosecutors understand how criminal organizations operate, and that understanding comes largely from FBI investigations initiated after Apalachin. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, RICO prosecutions devastate the American Mafia. Entire family leaderships are convicted and imprisoned. The Gambino family, the Genovese family, the Lucchese family, the Colombo family, the Bonanno family, all are crippled by aggressive federal prosecutions. The organizational structures that survived for decades are dismantled. The code of silence is broken by informants seeking leniency. The political corruption that once protected mob families is reduced by aggressive prosecution of corrupt officials. By the 1990s, the American Mafia is a shadow of its former self. The families still exist, but their power is diminished. Their profits are reduced. Their operations are constantly disrupted by law enforcement. The era of Mafia dominance over American organized crime has ended, and it all traces back to Apalachin. The meeting forced Hoover to acknowledge what he had denied for decades. That acknowledgement led to the Top Hoodlum program. That program developed FBI expertise. That expertise enabled RICO prosecutions. Those prosecutions destroyed the Mafia. Sergeant Edgar Croswell, establishing a roadblock on a country road in rural New York, triggered a chain of events that ultimately dismantled organized crime in America. He could not have imagined the consequences when he decided to question suspicious visitors to Joseph Barbara's estate. But his decision to act on reasonable suspicion, to document what he observed, and to trust his instincts changed American law enforcement history. The legal aftermath of Apalachin extends for years, producing convictions, acquittals, appeals, and endless legal maneuvering. The primary prosecution targets 27 attendees who are indicted on December 6, 1957, for conspiring to obstruct justice by lying about the meeting's purpose. The indictment alleges that the defendants gathered to discuss criminal activities, then lied to law enforcement and a grand jury about why they were in Apalachin. The trial begins on May 21, 1959, in federal court in Manhattan. Judge Irving Kaufman presides. The courtroom is packed with reporters, spectators, and family members. The defendants include some of the most powerful mob bosses in America: Vito Genovese, Joseph Profaci, Joseph Bonanno, Russell Bufalino, and others. Their collective legal representation costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. The prosecution's case is straightforward. These men gathered for a criminal meeting. They fled when police arrived, and they provided false explanations for their presence. The government presents testimony from the state troopers who established the roadblock, documents showing the defendants' criminal backgrounds, and evidence that they all told identical lies about visiting a sick friend and attending a barbecue. The defense strategy is equally simple. Attending a meeting is not illegal. Lying to police is not obstruction of justice unless the lies materially interfere with an investigation, and the defendants had no obligation to explain their private activities to law enforcement. Defense attorneys argue that the prosecution is criminalizing innocent social behavior, that the government is persecuting Italian Americans based on ethnic prejudice, and that the evidence does not prove conspiracy. The trial lasts 2 weeks. On May 28, 1959, the jury convicts 20 of the 27 defendants. 7 are acquitted. Those convicted face sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years in federal prison and fines up to $10,000. Judge Kaufman lectures the defendants, describing them as criminals who show no remorse and who threaten American society. He denies bail pending appeal, ordering the convicted defendants to begin serving their sentences immediately. The convictions are celebrated in newspapers across the country. Editorial writers praise the prosecutions as proof that the Mafia can be held accountable. Law enforcement officials hail the verdicts as vindication of their efforts to combat organized crime. The public, which has been reading about Apalachin for 18 months, feels satisfaction that the mobsters who fled through the woods are finally facing consequences. But the victory is short-lived. The defendants immediately appeal, arguing that the convictions are based on insufficient evidence and improper legal theories. They claim that lying about attending a meeting does not constitute obstruction of justice, that the government must prove the meeting had a specific criminal purpose, and that the prosecution failed to establish conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt. On November 28, 1960, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit overturns all 20 convictions. The appellate court rules that the government failed to prove the meeting had a criminal purpose. Without evidence of what was discussed or planned, the court concludes, simply attending the gathering and lying about it does not constitute obstruction of justice. The defendant's lies may be suspicious, but suspicion is not proof of crime. The decision is devastating for federal prosecutors. After 3 years of investigation and prosecution, after extensive publicity and public expectation of accountability, the Apalachin defendants walk free on a technicality. The government could retry them, but the appellate court's reasoning suggests that any new trial would face the same evidentiary problems. Federal prosecutors decide not to pursue further charges. The legal outcome reveals a fundamental problem with prosecuting the Apalachin attendees. While everyone knows they are criminals, while everyone understands the meeting was related to organized crime, the government cannot prove specific criminal acts occurred at the gathering. The state police interrupted the meeting before substantive business was conducted. The attendees maintained absolute silence about the meeting's purpose. There are no recordings, no documents, no witnesses willing to describe what was discussed. This failure teaches federal prosecutors important lessons about how to investigate organized crime. Future cases focus on documenting specific criminal activities rather than simply proving association with criminals. Wiretaps record conversations revealing criminal plans. Informants provide testimony about organizational structures and decision-making processes. Financial records prove income from illegal sources. The prosecutions of the 1970s and 1980s succeed where the Apalachin prosecutions failed, because they focus on provable crimes rather than mere attendance at meetings. But even though the convictions are overturned, Apalachin still damages the defendants. Several die before the appeals are resolved. Joseph Barbara in 1959, Joseph Prefazzi in 1962, of natural causes, and others from age and stress. Those who survive face years of legal bills, federal scrutiny, and damaged reputations. Their businesses are investigated. Their finances are audited. Their associations are monitored. The legal battles may have ended in acquittal, but the broader consequences persist. While the criminal prosecutions are proceeding, Congress launches its own investigation of organized crime and labor union corruption. Senator John L. McClellan of Arkansas chairs the Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, commonly called the McClellan Committee. The committee's chief counsel is Robert F. Kennedy, younger brother of Senator John F. Kennedy, and an aggressive prosecutor who views organized crime as a cancer threatening American society. The McClellan Committee hearings, which begin in 1957 and continue through 1960, expose the scope of Mafia infiltration into labor unions, particularly the Teamsters. Witnesses describe how mob figures control union leadership, embezzle pension funds, and use violence to maintain power. The hearings reveal that organized crime is not simply about gambling and loan sharking, it is about control of legitimate industries through corruption and intimidation. Many Apalachin attendees are subpoenaed to testify. The committee wants to know why they gathered, what they discussed, and how organized crime operates. But the mobsters invoke their Fifth Amendment rights on virtually every substantive question. When asked about the Apalachin meeting, they refuse to answer. When asked about their criminal activities, they refuse to answer. When asked about their relationships with other attendees, they refuse to answer. This stonewalling frustrates the committee but also proves their point. These men have something to hide. Innocent people do not refuse to explain why they attended a social gathering. Legitimate businessmen do not invoke constitutional protections when asked about their work. The refusal to testify is itself evidence of guilt, at least in the court of public opinion. The McClellan Committee hearings receive extensive media coverage. Americans watch on television as mob bosses refuse to answer questions, as labor union officials admit to corruption, and as Robert Kennedy aggressively interrogates witnesses. The hearings educate the public about organized crime's power and its infiltration into American institutions. They create political pressure for stronger laws against racketeering and corruption. The hearings also make Robert Kennedy a national figure. His aggressive questioning, his obvious contempt for organized crime, and his determination to hold criminals accountable resonate with the public. When his brother becomes president in 1961 and appoints Robert as Attorney General, RFK brings this same aggressive approach to the Justice Department. He makes dismantling organized crime a top priority, dramatically increasing prosecutions and creating specialized units focused on mafia investigations. The McClellan Committee's most significant contribution is its detailed documentation of how organized crime operates. The hearings produce thousands of pages of testimony, creating a comprehensive record of mob activities, organizational structures, and methods. This information becomes invaluable for future prosecutors and investigators. It provides a roadmap for understanding the Mafia as an institution, rather than simply a collection of criminals. One particularly revealing witness is Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese family, who testifies before the committee in September and October 1963. Valachi is the first member of La Cosa Nostra to publicly break the code of silence and describe the organization's internal workings. He explains the initiation ceremony, the organizational hierarchy, the rules and traditions, and the decision-making processes. He confirms that the Mafia is real, that it is organized nationally through a commission, and that it operates according to established procedures rather than chaos. Valachi's testimony is sensational. He describes murders, including several he committed personally. He identifies bosses and their families. He explains how criminal operations are structured and managed. He provides details that only an insider could know, lending credibility to his account. His testimony is televised, attracting millions of viewers who are fascinated by this glimpse into organized crime's secret world. The Justice Department uses Valachi's information to enhance ongoing investigations. His testimony helps prosecutors understand relationships between families, identify key figures, and develop strategies for pursuing cases. While Valachi's testimony alone does not lead to major convictions, he can only describe events from his limited perspective as a low-ranking soldier. His willingness to cooperate demonstrates that omerta can be broken. Valachi becomes the first of many informants. Throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, more Mafia members follow his example, choosing cooperation over imprisonment or death. Each informant provides additional details, corroborating and expanding on previous testimony. The accumulated information from dozens of informants eventually provides prosecutors with comprehensive evidence to pursue RICO cases against entire families. But Valachi's decision to cooperate traces back to Apalachin. The exposure of the Mafia's leadership at Joseph Barbara's estate demonstrated to law enforcement that the organization was vulnerable. The subsequent investigations created pressure that made some members like Valachi question their loyalty. When Valachi was imprisoned and became convinced that Vito Genovese had ordered his murder, he chose cooperation as self-preservation. Apalachin did not directly cause Valachi's decision, but it created the environment that made such cooperation possible. The years following Apalachin see unprecedented turnover in Mafia leadership. The old generation of bosses, men who came of age during Prohibition and consolidated power in the 1930s and 1940s, either die, are imprisoned, or are forced into retirement. The next generation assumes control, but they inherit organizations weakened by law enforcement pressure and internal suspicion. Joseph Profaci, boss of one of New York's 5 families, faces rebellion from within his own organization in the early 1960s. The Gallo brothers, Larry, Joey, and Albert Gallo, lead a faction demanding fairer distribution of family profits. They believe Profaci keeps too much for himself, while soldiers earn too little. The dispute escalates to warfare. Multiple murders occur. The family fractures. Profaci dies of liver cancer in June 1962, before the conflict is resolved. His successor, Joseph Magliocco, inherits a family in chaos and dies within a year. Joseph Bonanno, another 5 families boss who attended Apalachin, becomes increasingly erratic in the early 1960s. He develops a grandiose plan to murder several rival bosses, including Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, thereby eliminating competition and making himself the dominant power in New York. The plot is exposed. The commission demands Bonanno appear before them to explain. He refuses. In October 1964, he is kidnapped, probably by members of his own family acting on commission orders, and held for weeks. After his release, he is forced into retirement. He moves to Arizona, writes an autobiography portraying himself as a misunderstood businessman, and lives until 2002. But his power ends in 1964. Tommy Lucchese, boss of the family that bears his name, survives Apalachin relatively unscathed, but dies of natural causes in 1967. His death creates succession problems. His underboss and successor, Carmine Tramunti, proves ineffective and is eventually imprisoned on narcotics charges. The family enters a period of instability that lasts for years. Carlo Gambino, as detailed earlier, emerges from Apalachin as the most powerful boss, but even he faces challenges. His family is targeted by aggressive federal investigations throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Several key members are convicted and imprisoned. Gambino himself survives mainly by being extremely cautious, avoiding electronic surveillance, and maintaining absolute discipline within his organization. When he dies in 1976, his carefully chosen successor, Paul Castellano, inherits a family that is wealthy and powerful but under constant federal scrutiny. The pattern is clear. Apalachin marked the end of the old Mafia's golden age. Before November 14, 1957, bosses operated with relative impunity, confident that corruption and denial would protect them. After Apalachin, every boss faces aggressive investigation, prosecution, and the constant threat of betrayal from informants. The meeting that was supposed to demonstrate organizational strength instead revealed organizational vulnerability. The younger generation that assumes control in the 1960s and 1970s operates in a fundamentally different environment. They must contend with FBI surveillance, informants within their organizations, RICO prosecutions, and public awareness of the Mafia's existence. They cannot rely on the political corruption that protected their predecessors. They cannot maintain the illusion of legitimacy. They are criminals operating in an increasingly hostile environment. Some adapt successfully. Carlo Gambino maintains power through extreme caution and discipline. His successor, Paul Castellano, continues this approach until his murder in 1985. But others fail to adapt. John Gotti, who orchestrates Castellano's murder and becomes boss of the Gambino family, embraces publicity and flamboyance. He grants media interviews. He attends high-profile events. He becomes known as the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don after several prosecutions failed to convict him. But Gotti's high profile attracts intensive federal investigation. In 1992, he is convicted on multiple charges including murder and racketeering. He dies in prison in 2002. Gotti represents the final generation of prominent mafia bosses. After his conviction, organized crime continues, but at a much reduced level. The families are smaller, less wealthy, less influential. They operate in the shadows, avoiding attention, struggling to recruit new members. The Mafia of the 1990s and 2000s is not the powerful institution of the 1950s. It is a declining enterprise, crippled by decades of prosecutions and unable to recover its former dominance. This decline traces directly to Apalachin. The meeting exposed the Mafia at its peak, just as law enforcement was beginning to develop effective tools to combat it. The combination of exposure and enhanced enforcement proved fatal to organized crime's power. Apalachin's influence extends beyond law enforcement and criminal justice. The incident profoundly affects American popular culture, shaping how organized crime is portrayed in media, literature, and film. Before Apalachin, the Mafia is either denied or romanticized. FBI Director Hoover insists it doesn't exist. Hollywood films portray gangsters as individual criminals rather than members of sophisticated organizations. The public has limited understanding of how organized crime actually operates. There is some awareness of corruption and racketeering, but little comprehension of the Mafia's national scope and institutional structure. Apalachin changes this perception. The photographs of bosses fleeing through woods, the revelations about a national meeting, the subsequent trials and congressional hearings, all of this educates the public about the Mafia's reality. Americans learn that organized crime is not random thuggery, but rather a structured enterprise with hierarchies, territories, and rules. They learn that mob families coordinate activities across state lines. They learn that bosses meet to discuss policy and settle disputes. This knowledge transforms popular culture. In the 1960s and 1970s, films and television shows begin portraying organized crime more realistically. The Godfather, 1972, depicts the Mafia as a complex organization with business operations, political connections, and family dynamics. The film's portrayal is based on extensive research into actual mob families, incorporating details that would have been unknown before Apalachin forced the Mafia into public view. Subsequent films, The Godfather Part II, 1974, Goodfellas, 1990, Casino, 1995, Donnie Brasco, 1997, continue this trend toward realism. They depict organizational structures, internal politics, and the banality of criminal enterprise. They show that mobsters are not romantic outlaws, but rather brutal businessmen exploiting illegal markets. They incorporate actual events, real figures, sometimes thinly disguised, and authentic details about Mafia operations. True crime literature similarly benefits from Apalachin's revelations. Books like The Valachi Papers, 1968, Honor Thy Father, 1971, and countless subsequent works provide detailed accounts of Mafia history and operations. These books are only possible because Apalachin and subsequent investigations exposed information that was previously hidden. Authors can describe organizational structures, explain traditions and rituals, and analyze strategic decisions because informants like Joseph Valachi broke omerta and provided insider perspectives. Television documentaries and news programs regularly feature Mafia stories, particularly when major bosses are prosecuted or murdered. The public has an insatiable appetite for organized crime content, fascinated by the contrast between brutal criminality and the veneer of respectability that mobsters often maintain. This fascination is commercially valuable. Mob stories sell books, attract viewers, and generate profits. But this cultural impact has problematic aspects. The Mafia becomes mythologized, transformed from criminal organization into cultural icon. Mobsters are portrayed as anti-heroes, rebels against conformity, men living by their own codes. Films like The Godfather present organized crime as almost noble, a family business where honor and loyalty matter more than money. This romanticization troubles law enforcement officials and victims' families. They argue that portraying mobsters sympathetically obscures the reality of organized crime, the murders, the extortion, the corruption, the communities destroyed by gambling and loan sharking. They point out that real mobsters are not honorable anti-heroes, but rather violent criminals who harm innocent people for profit. The Italian-American community faces particular challenges from Mafia's cultural prominence. Despite the fact that the vast majority of Italian Americans have no connection to organized crime, the association between Italian ethnicity and the Mafia persists in popular culture. Italian Americans face stereotyping, discrimination, and offensive assumptions. Organizations like the Italian American Civil Rights League, founded in 1970 by Joseph Colombo, ironically himself a Mafia boss, protest what they view as ethnic defamation. These concerns have some merit. Media portrayals often emphasize Italian ethnicity unnecessarily, reinforcing stereotypes. But the reality is that the historical mafia in America was predominantly composed of Italian and Sicilian immigrants and their descendants. This ethnic character was central to the organization's identity, its traditions, and its operations. Portraying the mafia accurately requires acknowledging its Italian roots, even while recognizing that most Italian Americans are law-abiding citizens with no mob connections. Apalachin contributed to this cultural phenomenon by making the mafia visible. Before the meeting, organized crime operated in shadows. After the meeting, it became a subject of public fascination. The exposure that destroyed the mafia's power simultaneously created its cultural legacy. Apalachin generates conspiracy theories that persist for decades. The most prominent theory asks, who tipped off the police? Did someone deliberately sabotage the meeting to damage rivals, expose the mafia to law enforcement, or achieve some other strategic objective? The official explanation is straightforward. Sergeant Edgar Croswell noticed unusual activity at Joseph Barber's estate, investigated, and established a roadblock based on his legitimate suspicions. This explanation is supported by Croswell's documented history of investigating Barbara and his testified account of events. There is no evidence of a tip from an informant or rival mobster, but the conspiracy theory has appeal. Many observers find it implausible that Croswell simply happened to conduct surveillance on the exact day of the most significant mafia meeting in American history. They note that the meeting was supposed to be secret, known only to attendees and their most trusted associates. How could a rural state trooper, with no inside information, discover it through random observation? The leading suspect in conspiracy theories is Carlo Gambino. As detailed earlier, Gambino benefited enormously from Apalachin's fallout. Vito Genovese, his primary rival, was exposed, prosecuted, and imprisoned. Other bosses were damaged or destroyed. Gambino emerged as the most powerful figure in American organized crime. Did he orchestrate this outcome by ensuring the meeting was discovered? The evidence for Gambino's involvement is entirely circumstantial. No witness has ever testified that Gambino tipped off police. No document has been discovered proving he provided information. No associate has claimed he discussed such a plan. The theory rests entirely on the observation that Gambino benefited, but benefiting from an event does not prove one caused it. Moreover, the theory has logical problems. If Gambino wanted to damage rivals, why would he attend the meeting himself? He was stopped at the roadblock, questioned, and forced to flee. He suffered the same humiliation as everyone else. If he had advanced knowledge that police would interrupt the meeting, why would he subject himself to that exposure? Defenders of the conspiracy theory argue that Gambino had to attend to avoid suspicion. If he was the only invited boss who didn't come, others would immediately suspect his involvement in the disaster. By attending and suffering the same consequences as everyone else, he maintained his cover while still achieving his strategic objectives. This reasoning is sophisticated but ultimately speculative. The simpler explanation, that Croswell discovered the meeting through competent police work, is more consistent with available evidence. Croswell had been investigating Barbara for years. He had informants who told him about Barbara's hotel reservations and food purchases. He observed unusual traffic to Barbara's estate. He made a reasonable decision to investigate. No conspiracy is required to explain his actions. Another conspiracy theory suggests that the FBI knew about the meeting in advance, but allowed it to proceed so the mafia would be publicly exposed. This theory is more plausible than the Gambino hypothesis, but equally unproven. There is no evidence that the FBI had advance knowledge of the Apalachin meeting. If Hoover had known, he likely would have ordered agents to observe and document the gathering, using it to support his own investigations rather than allowing state police to claim credit. A third theory, advanced by some mob historians, suggests that Joseph Bonanno set up the meeting to trap his rivals. According to this theory, Bonanno was already planning to challenge the commission's authority and saw an opportunity to expose other bosses while positioning himself to take power in the resulting chaos. But this theory is contradicted by the fact that Bonanno attended the meeting himself and fled with everyone else. If he were orchestrating a trap, why would he walk into it? The appeal of conspiracy theories is understandable. Apalachin was such a consequential disaster for organized crime, that attributing it to random chance or routine police work seems insufficient. It feels more satisfying to believe that someone orchestrated the exposure, that the meeting's interruption served someone's strategic purposes. Conspiracy theories provide narrative coherence that random events lack. But history is often less tidy than conspiracy theories suggest. Sometimes significant events result from coincidence, miscalculation, or simple bad luck. Sometimes competent individuals, like Sergeant Croswell, succeed through skill and determination rather than because they're part of elaborate conspiracies. Sometimes the obvious explanation is correct. Apalachin was a mafia meeting that was discovered by alert police officers who were doing their jobs. The exposure was not planned by Carlo Gambino or the FBI or Joseph Bonanno. It was the result of Vito Genovese's overconfidence, Joseph Barbara's poor judgment, and Edgar Croswell's competent investigation. The consequences: destroyed careers, transformed law enforcement, reshaped mafia leadership, were real, but they were not the product of conspiracy. They were simply what happened when organized crime's greatest secret was accidentally revealed. More than 6 decades after November 14, 1957, Apalachin remains the most significant single event in American organized crime history. Its impact continues to resonate through law enforcement, popular culture, and the remnants of the mafia itself. For law enforcement, Apalachin represents the moment when denial became impossible. Before the meeting, federal authorities could claim organized crime was exaggerated or localized. After the meeting, such claims were absurd. The list of attendees, the photographs, the testimony, all of it proved the mafia was real, national, and powerful. This forced acknowledgement led to the institutional changes: the Top Hoodlum program, the McClellan Committee hearings, aggressive prosecutions, RICO statutes, that eventually dismantled organized crime's power. Modern FBI agents studying organized crime begin their education with Apalachin. The incident teaches fundamental lessons about the importance of local intelligence, the value of persistent investigation, and the dangers of institutional denial. It demonstrates that effective law enforcement requires responding to evidence rather than maintaining convenient fictions. It shows that major breakthroughs sometimes come from unexpected sources, in this case, a state trooper in rural New York rather than federal agents in Washington. For prosecutors, Apalachin illustrates both opportunities and limitations. The meeting provided invaluable intelligence about organizational structures, key figures, and relationships between families. This information informed decades of subsequent investigations. But the failure to convict most attendees on conspiracy charges demonstrates the difficulty of prosecuting mere association. Effective prosecution requires evidence of specific crimes, not just proof that criminals met. This lesson shaped how federal prosecutors approached RICO cases, focusing on documented criminal activities rather than organizational membership. For the Mafia itself, Apalachin marks the beginning of the end. The organization never recovered from the exposure. The bosses who fled through the woods, Vito Genovese, Joseph Profaci, Joseph Bonanno, and dozens of others, represented the last generation that operated with confidence and impunity. Their successors inherited organizations under siege, constantly defending against prosecutions, informants, and internal suspicion. Today's organized crime is fundamentally different from the Mafia of 1957. The families still exist, but they are smaller, weaker, less wealthy. They operate in the shadows, avoiding attention, struggling to recruit new members. They cannot control legitimate industries through labor racketeering. They cannot operate with confidence that corruption will protect them. They cannot gather openly to discuss business. The era that Apalachin ended is gone forever. The physical site of the meeting bears little evidence of its historical significance. Joseph Barbara's estate was subdivided after his death. The main house still stands, but is privately owned. A historical marker on Route 17 notes the location of the Apalachin Meeting of Crime Bosses, November 14, 1957. Tourists occasionally stop to take photographs. Local residents regard the incident with mixed feelings: pride that their community played a role in exposing organized crime, but also discomfort with being forever associated with the Mafia. Sergeant Edgar Croswell died in 1990, having lived most of his life in relative obscurity after his moment of historical significance. He never sought fame or fortune from his role at Apalachin. He simply did his job, noticed something suspicious, and followed through with competent investigation. In an era of celebrity law enforcement officials and high-profile prosecutions, Croswell's quiet professionalism seems almost quaint. But his example remains instructive. Effective law enforcement often depends on observant officers who trust their instincts and act on reasonable suspicions. The men who attended the Apalachin meeting are all dead now. The last survivors, including several who managed to avoid identification at the roadblock, died in the 1990s and early 2000s. Their deaths closed a chapter in American criminal history. The era they represented, when the Mafia was powerful, wealthy, and relatively secure, is as distant from contemporary organized crime as Prohibition is from the modern drug trade. But their legacy persists. The families they built continue operating, however diminished. The cultural fascination they inspired continues generating films, books, and documentaries. The law enforcement innovations they provoked continue shaping how authorities combat organized crime. The lessons of their exposure continue informing how criminal organizations attempt to maintain secrecy. Apalachin was supposed to be a routine meeting. It became a disaster. That disaster destroyed some men, elevated others, and transformed American law enforcement. One afternoon in rural New York changed everything, not because anyone planned it that way, but because a state trooper noticed too many Cadillacs on a country road and decided to investigate. The domino effect began with Edgar Croswell's suspicions. It continued with mobsters fleeing through the woods. It accelerated with prosecutions and congressional hearings. It culminated in decades of aggressive enforcement that dismantled organized crime's power. Joseph Barbara died broken and humiliated. Vito Genovese died in federal prison. Joseph Bonanno died in exile. Carlo Gambino died wealthy but under constant surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover died having been forced to acknowledge what he denied for decades. The American Mafia died slowly, crippled by prosecutions that began with Apalachin's exposure. And it all started because one observant cop trusted his instincts on a November afternoon in 1957. The meeting lasted less than 3 hours. The consequences last forever.